They tell you that a monster is born from darkness. They lie. A monster is born from the blinding white light of greed. Before the maze, before the hunger, and before the hero, there was a promise broken on the shores of Crete. King Minos, a man who built an empire on the back of the sea, asked the gods for a sign of his right to rule. He asked Poseidon for a miracle, and the Earthshaker delivered. Out of the churning foam of the Aegean rose a creature that defied the laws of biology, a bull of snow-white hide and eyes like polished obsidian. It was a gift meant to be returned to the divine through sacrifice, a simple transaction, power for a life. But Minos, looking at the beast, saw more than a sacrifice. He saw a trophy. He saw a breeding stock. He kept the god's bull and slaughtered a lesser animal from his own herd, thinking a god wouldn't notice a swap in the ledger. But you cannot cheat the sea. Poseidon did not strike the king's palace with a wave. He did not sink his fleet. He did something far more surgical. He reached into the mind of the queen, Pasiphae, and planted a divine itch. Imagine a lust that isn't yours, a biological command coming from the stars, forcing a refined royal woman to look at a beast with a hunger that scorched her throat. It was the first transformation of the story, not of the body, but of the soul. Pasiphae was a daughter of the sun, much like her sister Circe, but her magic was useless against a god's obsession. She was a prisoner in her own skin. She turned to the only man in Knossos who could turn a nightmare into a reality. Daedalus, the inventor, the man of cogs and wood. Under the cover of a moonless night, Daedalus built a hollow wooden cow, draped in the hide of a freshly killed heifer. It was a masterpiece of deception. Pasiphae climbed inside, her breathing shallow, her mind shattered as she waited for the white bull to approach. The gods do not care for consent, they care for symmetry, and so the curse was completed. When the child was born 9 months later, the palace of Knossos fell in silence. The midwives didn't bring the baby to the king for a blessing. They dropped their lamps and fled into the night. The baby was named Asterion, the star. He was beautiful and terrible. Below the neck, he had the soft pink skin of a prince, but rising from his shoulders was the heavy furred head of a calf call, with wide liquid eyes that seemed to hold the vastness of the ocean. He didn't cry like a human. He bellowed with a sound that vibrated the palace floorboards. For 3 years, the tragedy was a domestic one. Pasiphae, driven by a mix of maternal instinct and lingering curse, tried to raise him. She fed him milk from golden bowls. She brushed the soft white fur on his brow. She called him her little star. But as the boy grew, his teeth sharpened. The calf's innocence was replaced by a predator's weight. He began to crave the smell of iron, the smell of blood. Minos looked at the star and saw his own failure walking on 2 legs. Every time Asterion bellowed, it was a reminder that the king was a thief and a coward. The shame was a poison that leaked through the palace walls. The people whispered. The priests looked away. Minos couldn't kill the boy. To spill the blood of a divine curse was to invite a second, deadlier punishment. So he chose a solution that was more cruel than execution. He chose architectural erasure. "Build me a place where the sun cannot find him," Minos commanded Daedalus. "Build me a tomb that breathes." And so the Labyrinth was born, a masterpiece of geometry designed to confuse the human mind and trap the animal spirit. Miles of gray limestone, thousands of dead ends, and a center that felt like the bottom of a well. The day they moved Asterion was the last day he ever saw the sky. They didn't drag him, they led him. They used a trail of honey and bread, treating it like a game. The 3-year-old prince followed the guards into the cool, damp dark of the entrance, his small human hand trailing along the smooth stone walls. He reached the center, a grand circular room with a single high vent that showed a square of the blue Cretan sky. He sat down to eat his honey bread. Asterion didn't understand the sound at first. He called out for his mother. He called for the light. But the only answer was the echo of his own voice, bouncing back at him from 1,000 identical corners. Minos had hidden his shame. He had buried his sin. But in the dark, the honey bread ran out. The prince's stomach began to growl. And as the star began to fade into the blackness of the maze, the Minotaur began to wake up. In the silence, in the dark. But the labyrinth has a long memory, and the hunger is just beginning. Time is the second maze. It is longer than any corridor, and darker than any pit. Inside the labyrinth, the years did not pass in seasons. They passed in heartbeats and hunger. The boy who was once called Asterion, the star, began to fade. In the total absence of light, the eyes do not go blind, they adapt. They learn to see the heat of a mouse, the vibration of a moth, the slow, cold pulse of the stone itself. But a boy cannot survive on shadows. While Asterion rotted in the dark, King Minos thrived in the sun. He had turned his shame into a weapon. After brutal war with Athens, a war fueled by the death of his human son, Androgeus, Minos demanded a price that would ensure Athens never rose again. He didn't ask for gold, he didn't ask for land, he asked for the harvest. Every 9 years, a black-sailed ship would arrive at the docks of Knossos. On board were 14 of Athens' finest, 7 boys and 7 girls, chosen by lot, their lives discarded to pay a debt they never signed. To the people of Crete, it was a religious duty. To Minos, it was a waste disposal system. To the creature in the maze, it was the only time he felt alive. Imagine the psychological warfare of the stone corridors. The guards would lead the 14 youths to the bronze doors. They would strip them of their clothes, their weapons, and their hope. Then they would push them into the mouth of the stone. The doors didn't just lock, they sealed. For the first few hours, the youths would huddle together. They would try to keep their voices low, thinking that silence was a shield. But the labyrinth was designed to amplify sound. A sob in the east corridor sounded like a scream in the west. A prayer whispered in the dark became a roar by the time it reached the center. The beast would listen. He was no longer a boy. He was a mountain of scar tissue and muscle, standing 7 feet tall. His human torso had thickened until it was wide as an ancient oak, and his bull's head had grown massive, the horns polished to a lethal point by constant rubbing against the limestone walls. He didn't hunt like a lion. He hunted like a ghost.
He knew every dead end. He knew which tiles groaned and which corners held the deepest shadows. One by one, the Athenian children would wander off. Fear is a dehydrating force. It makes you move when you should stay still. They would separate in the dark, searching for an exit that didn't exist. And that is when the star would find them. There is a specific horror in being destroyed by something that still possesses a human hand. The beast didn't just gore them, he gripped them. He touched their faces with fingers that still remembered the warmth of a mother's touch, even as his bovine jaws tore into their life. It wasn't malice, it was the only form of connection he had left. To consume was to hold, to kill was to be seen. For 27 years, this was the rhythm of Gnosis. 3 harvests, 42 lives. The labyrinth wasn't just a prison anymore. It was a temple of trauma. The walls were stained with the grease of human fat and the salt of tears. In the center of it all, the creature sat in the bones of his guests, his head bowed, his eyes staring up at that single square of blue sky he could never reach. He was the most powerful thing in Crete and the most pathetic. But the 4th harvest was coming, and this time the black-sailed ship carried something different. It carried a man who didn't fear the dark. It carried a man who brought a clue to the end of the world. A man who brought a thread that would lead not to a rescue, but to an execution. The blood and the bone are settled, but the thread is about to be pulled. And the beast is about to meet the only thing more dangerous than a monster, a hero.
The gods do not build cages, they build families, and then they wait for the blood to turn against itself. There is no iron bar stronger than the silence of a sister, and no stone wall thicker than the ambition of a stranger. In the high starlit terraces of Knossos, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the salt of the sea. To a visitor, it was a paradise of marble and gold, a testament to the power of King Minos. But inside the heart of Princess Ariadne, there was only the smell of dust and the faint copper tang of old blood rising from the floorboards. She was the daughter of a king who used terror as currency, a girl who had watched her father's power grow alongside the hunger of the creature in the pit. Ariadne was a bird in a gilded cage, trapped between a father who saw her as a pawn and a brother who was hidden away like a dirty secret. She knew that her own life was merely a delayed sacrifice. One day she would be married off to consolidate a throne, or she would be discarded when she no longer served the king's image of perfection. Then came Theseus. He did not arrive like the other tributes, cowering, weeping, or praying to gods who had clearly turned their backs. Theseus stood at the prow of the black-sailed ship with his chin high and his hand on the hilt of a hidden blade. He was a prince of Athens, yes, but to Ariadne he was something more practical. He was a door. He was a way to the horizon. The tragedy of the Minotaur is often marketed to you as a story of a brave hero slaying a mindless beast. But look closer. It is actually the story of a sister handing a stranger the key to her brother's heart just so she could stop feeling the walls of the palace closing in. Ariadne did not fall in love with Theseus because of his valor. She fell in love with the possibility of his departure. But the labyrinth was not a place one simply walked into and out of. It was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance designed by Daedalus, the same man who had built the wooden cow for Ariadne's mother, Pasiphae. Daedalus was the architect of the family's ruin, a man of cogs and geometry who understood that the best prison is one where the prisoner believes they are moving forward when they are actually circling their own grave. A map of ink and parchment would be useless in the maze, for the corridors were designed to shift in the mind, to play with the inner ear, and to make every turn feel like the first. Ariadne sought out the inventor in the dead of night. She did not ask for a map, she asked for a clue. She demanded a way to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the world of the lost. Daedalus, perhaps feeling the weight of his own mechanical sins, gave her the only thing that could defeat the maze: a map of touch, a ball of red silk thread. Under the cover of a moonless night, Ariadne met Theseus at the heavy bronze gates of the labyrinth. Imagine the friction of that encounter: the princess, desperate for a life she had never known, and the hero, desperate for a glory that would never fade. They stood in the shadow of the stone, the air cooling as the labyrinth exhaled its damp, mossy breath. She handed him the thread and a silver sword, weapons provided by the family to kill the family. "Take this," she whispered, her voice a sharp blade in the dark. "Tie it to the lintel of the door. Let it trail behind you like a vein. If you kill the beast, follow the red line back to me, and when you leave, you take me with you." It was a contract signed in shadows and sealed with the promise of exile. Theseus did not love her, he needed her as a navigator, and Ariadne did not love him, she needed him as a vehicle. They were two predators using each other to escape a larger trap. The bronze doors groaned as they opened, a sound that vibrated through the foundation of the island, a sound that surely reached the ears of the beast in the center. Theseus stepped into the dark. He did not go in as a victim, and he did not go in as a hero. He went in as an assassin with a lifeline. Every step Theseus took into the maze, the red thread unspooled behind him. It lay on the cold limestone like a streak of fresh blood, vibrant and unnatural against the gray, ancient stone. As he descended, the silence of the labyrinth began to change. To the beast in the center, the sound of the thread unrolling was a new and terrifying language. For decades, the Minotaur had known only two types of sound: the silence of the stone and the frantic, chaotic scurrying of the terrified children. But the thread had a different rhythm. It was a rhythmic hiss, hiss, hiss against the floor, a sound of steady, calculated progress. It was the sound of order encroaching on a world of chaos. It was the sound of a plan. The beast had spent his life in a place where everything was random, where every turn was a gamble. But the thread was intent. The thread was the world of the sun coming to collect a debt from the world of the shadow. As Theseus moved deeper, the air grew thick with old bone and the grease of past tributes. He did not look back. He followed his own shadow, guided by the red line that connected him to the heartbeat of the girl waiting at the gate. He was the only person in the history of the world to enter that place with the absolute certainty of leaving it. He had turned the labyrinth into a simple corridor. In the center of the maze, the creature that was once a boy, the prince who had been given honey bread and then locked away, stood up. His massive bull-like head tilted to the side. He smelled the iron of the sword. He smelled the jasmine and sea salt on the thread. He felt the vibration of a footfall that was not running away, but running toward him. For the first time in his life, the Minotaur did not feel the pangs of hunger. He felt a cold, sharp prick of fear. He realized that the red line was not just a map for the intruder, it was a noose for the resident. The hunter was no longer the one with the horns. The hunter was the man who had brought the light of the outside world into the dark. The thread is taut. The sword is drawn. The silence of the labyrinth is about to be broken by the sound of a brother's final breath, orchestrated by a sister's final betrayal. The red line has been drawn, and there is no turning back. The labyrinth was never just a building. It was a mathematical prayer to the god of silence. When Daedalus laid the first stones, he didn't just build walls, he built a machine designed to strip a human being of their orientation, their memory, and eventually their soul. To enter the maze is to enter a digestive tract made of limestone, a place where the sun is a myth, and the only reality is the rough, cold texture of the rock against your palm. Theseus stepped past the bronze threshold, and the world of the living vanished. The first thing the maze takes is your sense of scale. Without a horizon, the mind begins to hallucinate. The corridors of Knossos were narrow, tall, and perfectly uniform. There were no windows, no torches, and no landmarks. There was only the clue, that single thin strand of red silk trailing from Theseus's left hand. As he moved deeper, the silence became heavy, a physical weight that pressed against his eardrums. In the absolute dark, your heart becomes a drum, and your breath becomes a gale. You begin to hear things that aren't there, the whisper of a mother, the laughter of a friend, the sound of the sea. But in the maze, every sound is a lie. Every step Theseus took was a step further away from his humanity. He was a prince, a warrior, a hero, but in the dark he was just a warm-blooded thing moving through a cold-blooded world. He followed the red thread, but the thread felt like a leash. It reminded him that he was connected to the surface, yes, but it also reminded him that he was a tethered animal, sent into a hole to perform a task for a king who didn't care if he survived. Behind him, the thread lay on the floor like a long, thin vein. Ahead of him, the darkness was absolute. But Theseus was not the only one in the dark. In the center of the maze, the creature that had once been the prince Asterion was listening. For years, the Minotaur had lived in a world of pure vibration. He knew the difference between the frantic, scuttling footsteps of the terrified children and the heavy, rhythmic tread of the guards. But this sound, this was new. It was the sound of someone who was not lost. It was the sound of a predator moving with a map. The beast stood up from his bed of bones. He didn't roar, he didn't bellow, he simply tilted his massive furred head and breathed. He could smell the outside world on Theseus. He smelled the salt of the Aegean, the pine of the Cretan forests, and the jasmine on the red thread. It was a smell he hadn't known since he was a child, sitting in his mother's lap. It was a smell that brought back the memory of the light, and with it the memory of his own tragedy. As Theseus descended deeper, he began to see the ghosts of the previous harvests. The labyrinth didn't clean itself. The bones of the 42 youths who had come before were scattered like driftwood in the corners. Theseus saw the small, delicate skulls of children and the broken ribs of boys who had tried to fight with their bare hands. He saw the marks of teeth on the stone, the desperate attempts of the starving to find a way out. The labyrinth was a library of failure, and Theseus was walking through the stacks. the psychological toll began to manifest. Theseus found himself talking to the thread. He found himself resenting Ariadne for staying in the sun while he walked through the dirt. He realized that Ariadne hadn't saved him. She had merely given him the means to be the last thing her brother ever saw. The hero and the monster were being drawn together by a line of silk. Two orphans of the house of Minos, one born to the throne and one born to the pit, but both destined to be used and then forgotten. The labyrinth amplified every sound Theseus made. The clank of his silver sword against his thigh sounded like a mountain falling. The rustle of his tunic was a thunderstorm. He was a beacon of noise in a world of stillness, and the beast was closing in. The Minotaur didn't run. He moved through the corridors with a slow, agonizing grace. He was at home in the dark. He didn't need a thread. The maze was his skin. He felt every vibration, every temperature shift, every drop of sweat that fell from the hero's brow. He was the architect of the shadows. He began to circle Theseus, moving through parallel corridors, keeping just out of sight, letting the hero feel the presence of a mountain moving in the blackness.
This was the true torture of the labyrinth, the anticipation. Theseus knew he was being watched. He felt the heavy, wet breath of the beast on the back of his neck, but when he spun around, there was only the red thread and the gray stone. He began to realize that the Minotaur wasn't just a beast to be slain. He was the physical manifestation of the dark itself. To kill the Minotaur, Theseus would have to become a part of the labyrinth. He would have to lose his fear of the dark, which meant losing his connection to the light. The thread in his hand felt thinner now, flimsier. It felt like it could snap at any moment, leaving him adrift in a stone sea. In the center of the world, in a chamber where the bones were piled high enough to reach the ceiling, the two paths finally met. Theseus stepped into a wide circular vault. Above him, a single narrow vent allowed a sliver of moonlight to pierce the gloom, a column of silver dust that hit the center of the floor. And there he was, Asterion, the Minotaur, the star. He wasn't charging. He was standing in the silver light, his massive horns casting a shadow that looked like a crown. He looked at Theseus, not with the eyes of a monster, but with the eyes of a prisoner who had been waiting for the executioner to finally arrive. The hero raised his sword. The beast lowered his head. The red thread lay between them, a line of blood on a floor of bone. The wander was over. The geography of fear had led them to this single, suffocating point. And as the labyrinth held its breath, the stone seemed to lean in, eager to drink the blood that was about to be spilled. In the center of the world, there is no room for glory. There is only the heat of breath and the coldness of steel. The vault where Asterion waited was a cathedral of bone, a circular room where the echoes of 42 deaths had settled like soot on the walls. When Theseus stepped into the sliver of moonlight, the red thread in his hand was no longer a guide, it was a leash. He stood before the beast, the silver sword of his father reflecting the pale, dusty light filtering from the vent above. He expected a monster. He expected a demon of mindless rage. But what he found was a mirror. The Minotaur did not roar. He did not charge with the fury of a bull. He stood on his human legs, his massive chest heaving with a wet, ragged sound. He looked at Theseus with eyes that were liquid and ancient, eyes that had seen nothing but stone for 27 years. For a heartbeat, the labyrinth held its breath. The hero and the beast stood at opposite ends of a red line, two sons of different worlds, both used by the same king, both trapped in the same architecture of shame. The struggle was not a dance. It was an ugly, frantic collision of flesh and bronze. The Minotaur lunged, his massive horns carving deep grooves into the limestone walls as Theseus rolled beneath the beast's reach. The air was filled with the smell of musk, old blood, and the sharp ozone scent of magic. Theseus didn't fight with honor. He fought with the desperation of a man who knew that if he fell, the thread would be lost, and he would become just another layer of dust on the floor. He grabbed the Minotaur by the hair, the coarse white fur of the bull's head slick with sweat. He felt the animal's raw power, the corded muscle of a creature that had been bred for the arena. But the Minotaur was clumsy. He was a creature of the dark, and the silver light of the moon blinded him. As the beast lowered his head for a final crushing gore, Theseus stepped aside. He drove the sword upward, through the soft throat of the bull and into the base of the human skull. The sound that left the Minotaur wasn't a bellow. It was a sigh. The beast hit the floor, his human hands twitching once, twice, and then going still. Theseus stood over him, soaked in blood that was too warm, too human. He had won, but the air felt no lighter. The silence of the maze didn't break. It grew thicker, absorbing the death of its only inhabitant.
The thread has reached its end, and the monster is finally at rest. But history is full of such hidden tragedies, stories where the villain you were taught to hate is merely a victim of a higher power. If you wish to walk these dark corridors with us and uncover the true faces of the ancient world, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell. Join our circle of witnesses and never let the truth stay buried in the dark. Theseus didn't linger. He didn't take a trophy. He grabbed the red thread, now slack and cooling in the dust, and he began to run. The journey back was a blur of gray stone and red silk. The thread was his only reality. He pulled himself through the corridors, his fingers raw from the friction of the cord. Every turn felt like a betrayal. He was walking back toward a world that would call him a savior, even though he felt like an assassin. When the bronze doors finally groaned open, the Cretan sun hit Theseus like a physical blow. It was too bright, too loud, too real. Ariadne was there, her face a mask of hope and terror. She saw the blood on his hands, and she didn't ask about her brother. She didn't ask about the boy who used to play with honey bread. She only asked for the horizon. "It is done," Theseus whispered. They fled. Under the cover of the morning mist, the black-sailed ship cut its moorings. They left the labyrinth behind, an empty shell, a stone tomb with a dead heart. They sailed for Naxos, the wind at their backs, but the red thread seemed to trail behind them in the water, a line of blood connecting them back to the island they had robbed.
On the shores of Naxos, Theseus performed the second execution of the week. He abandoned Ariadne. While she slept, dreaming of a throne in Athens, the hero sailed away. Why? Some say he was commanded by a god. Others say he simply couldn't look at her without seeing the labyrinth. She was the one who gave him the thread. She was the one who helped him kill her own blood. In his eyes, she wasn't a lover. She was a witness to his darkest hour. He left her to wake up alone on a beach, just as Asterion had spent his life alone in a cave. The final tragedy, however, was not of malice, but of memory. In his haste to flee the shadows of Crete, Theseus forgot the promise he had made to his father, King Aegeus. He had promised to change the black sails of the tribute ship if he survived. As the ship approached the cliffs of Sunion, the old king Aegeus stood on the precipice, his eyes straining for a glimmer of white, but the sails remained as black as a funeral shroud. The king did not wait for the ship to dock. He did not ask for a report. He saw the black sails and felt the labyrinth's cold reach across the sea. He threw himself from the cliffs, his body becoming one with the Aegean. Theseus returned to a crown, but he returned to a city of mourning. He had killed the monster, but he had brought the tragedy home. He had followed the thread out of the maze, but he could never untangle himself from the blood he spilled within it. The labyrinth still stands, they say, not in Crete, but in the minds of men. It is the maze we build when we hide our mistakes. It is the darkness we create when we choose the sword over the hand. Asterion died in the dark so that Theseus could live in the light, but the light of Athens was bought by the blood of a brother and the life of a father.